The fluorescent lights of the Riverside Veterans Medical Center buzzed overhead as Elena Rodriguez approached the security checkpoint, her worn desert combat boots clicking against the polished linoleum floor. The faded army patch on her olive drab jacket caught the harsh lighting as she reached for her employee badge. Behind the glass partition, Marcus Webb barely looked up from his newspaper, his expression shifting from boredom to visible disgust as he took in her appearance. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a professional medical facility, not some military surplus store. We have dress codes here." Elena paused, her weathered hands steady as she held up her identification card. The morning shift was just beginning, and already a small crowd of employees and visitors had gathered behind her, their conversations dying down as they sensed the tension building at the security desk. "I work here," she said quietly, her voice carrying the measured calm of someone accustomed to hostile environments. Marcus leaned forward, squinting at her badge through the glass before letting out a harsh laugh. "A janitor wearing combat gear. Lady, this isn't Call of Duty. Show some respect for the real veterans who come through these doors." What Marcus Webb didn't know was that the quiet woman standing before him had earned every thread of that uniform during 3 brutal deployments in Afghanistan. What he couldn't see were the commendations hidden away in a shoebox in her modest apartment, or the Purple Heart she'd never worn outside her bedroom. What he failed to recognize was that he had just humiliated someone who had once saved an entire platoon under enemy fire, using nothing but her medical training and unwavering courage under pressure. The crowd behind Elena shifted uncomfortably as Marcus's voice grew louder, drawing more attention to the unfolding scene. Someone in the gathering had already pulled out their phone, the small device capturing every word of what was about to become a moment that would change everything. Elena Rodriguez had never planned to become invisible. At 34, she moved through the corridors of Riverside Veterans Medical Center with the purposeful stride of someone who understood that healing happened in quiet moments, not grand gestures. Her job as a medical records clerk paid the bills and kept her close to the community she understood best, even if most days she felt like a ghost haunting the very halls where she belonged. The apartment she called home sat on the 3rd floor of Sunset Ridge apartment complex, a collection of beige stucco buildings that housed a mixture of young families, retirees, and people like Elena who had learned to find contentment in simplicity. Her living room was sparse but clean, dominated by a small television and a worn leather chair that had belonged to her grandfather. The walls displayed no military memorabilia, no photographs in dress uniform, no visible reminders of the life she had left behind in the mountains of Afghanistan 3 years earlier. Those reminders lived in a cardboard shoebox tucked beneath her bed, alongside the medication bottles she tried not to think about, and the letters from the Department of Veterans Affairs that she answered with dutiful precision. The Purple Heart nestled there in its presentation case, earned during her second deployment when an improvised explosive device had torn through her convoy, leaving her with shrapnel scars along her left arm and a persistent ringing in her ears that the doctors called tinnitus, but she simply called Tuesday. Most mornings Elena woke before dawn and prepared for her day with military efficiency, coffee brewed strong and black, a quick breakfast of toast and whatever fruit was on sale at the corner market, and then the ritual of choosing what to wear. The olive drab jacket had become her uniform of choice, not because she wanted to advertise her service, but because it was practical, warm, and reminded her of a time when she had known exactly who she was and what she was supposed to do. Her colleagues at the medical center knew Elena as reliable but reserved, the kind of employee who completed her tasks without fanfare and rarely participated in office birthday celebrations or happy hour invitations. Dr. Kevin Park, who supervised the records department, had tried several times to draw her into conversations about her background, sensing something deeper beneath her professional courtesy, but Elena had perfected the art of deflecting personal questions with polite smiles and topic changes. The work itself suited her temperament perfectly. Medical records required attention to detail, an understanding of complex systems, and the ability to handle sensitive information with discretion. Elena had spent her military career managing casualty reports and coordinating medical evacuations under conditions that would have broken most people, so organizing civilian medical files felt almost meditative by comparison. She took satisfaction in ensuring that every document was properly filed, every insurance claim correctly processed, and every veteran who walked through their doors received the care they had earned. 3 evenings a week, Elena supplemented her income by teaching emergency medical technician courses at Desert Springs Community College. The extra money helped cover her rent and allowed her to maintain the 15-year-old Honda Civic that had become her lifeline to independence. More importantly, teaching gave her a way to share the medical knowledge she had gained during her combat deployments without having to explain the circumstances under which she had acquired those skills. Her students at Desert Springs range from fresh-faced college kids hoping to become paramedics to middle-aged career changers seeking stability in healthcare. Elena taught them how to assess trauma patients, how to maintain composure during medical emergencies, and how to make life-or-death decisions under pressure. What she didn't tell them was that she had learned these lessons while treating wounded soldiers in the back of armored vehicles, with mortar rounds exploding overhead, and radio chatter crackling with desperate requests for medical support. The commute between her apartment, the medical center, and the college took Elena through neighborhoods that told the story of Phoenix's evolution from desert outpost to sprawling metropolis. She passed strip malls and subdivisions, veteran service organizations and military surplus stores, all of them serving a population that included thousands of former service members trying to build new lives in civilian society. Elena felt connected to this community in theory but isolated from it in practice, carrying her service record like a secret she couldn't quite bring herself to share. Her isolation had deepened after the incident at Copper Canyon Shopping Plaza 6 months earlier. Elena had been running errands on a Saturday afternoon, wearing her usual combination of jeans, boots, and the olive drab jacket, when she witnessed an elderly man collapse near the food court. Her medical training had kicked in immediately, and she had dropped to the floor to begin CPR while someone called 911. The man had survived, but not before a store security guard had demanded to know what authority she had to provide medical treatment, questioning whether a military wannabe should be touching other customers. The confrontation had been brief but humiliating, taking place in front of dozens of shoppers who stared and whispered while Elena tried to explain her qualifications. Even after the paramedics arrived and confirmed that her intervention had likely saved the man's life, Elena had felt the weight of suspicious glances and whispered comments about people who dress up like soldiers for attention. She had left the shopping plaza feeling more disconnected than ever, questioning whether wearing any remnant of her military service was worth the assumptions and judgment it seemed to invite. These experiences had taught Elena to anticipate criticism and prepare for dismissal, but they had also reinforced her determination to continue serving in whatever capacity she could. The military had trained her to complete the mission regardless of personal comfort, and she had adapted that philosophy to civilian life with mixed results. She would continue working with veterans through her job at the medical center, continue teaching life-saving skills to EMT students, and continue wearing the jacket that reminded her of the best version of herself, even if others couldn't see past their own assumptions about who belonged in uniform and who didn't. The morning that would change everything had started like any other. Elena had prepared her coffee, checked the weather forecast and selected her usual combination of dark jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and the olive drab jacket that had become her signature. She had driven through the quiet streets of early morning Phoenix, listening to news radio and thinking about the day's tasks ahead. The medical center's parking lot had been nearly empty when she arrived, giving her the peaceful start to the workday that she had learned to treasure. Walking through those automatic doors, Elena had felt the familiar mixture of purpose and anonymity that defined her civilian life. She belonged in this building, served its mission every day, and took pride in the small but important role she played in caring for veterans and their families. She had expected to badge in quietly, exchange polite greetings with the overnight security staff, and begin another day of methodical, meaningful work. Instead, she found herself standing at Marcus Webb's security checkpoint, feeling the familiar weight of judgment and assumption settling around her shoulders like a too heavy coat. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter than usual, the silence of the gathering crowd more oppressive, and the distance between who she was and who others saw her to be more vast than ever. As Marcus Webb's voice rose in pitch and volume, Elena Rodriguez prepared herself for another battle in a war she had never wanted to fight, armed only with the quiet dignity she had learned to carry and the unshakable knowledge that some victories could only be won through patience, precision, and an absolute refusal to abandon the mission. The automatic doors continued to whoosh open and closed behind the growing crowd, bringing in more employees and early morning visitors who would witness what happened next. Elena's fingers found the edge of her jacket, feeling the familiar texture of the fabric that had once represented everything she was proud to be, and prepared to defend not just her right to wear it, but her right to belong in a community that should have welcomed her home with open arms. The confrontation at the security checkpoint had been just the beginning. Word of Marcus Webb's public humiliation of the fake soldier in the medical records department spread through the Riverside Veterans Medical Center like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations in break rooms and embellished retellings during shift changes. What should have been a forgotten moment of workplace tension instead became the foundation for a campaign of systematic exclusion that would test Elena Rodriguez in ways that combat never had. Marcus Webb had worked security at the medical center for 8 years, long enough to develop a sense of ownership over the building's daily rhythms and an inflated perception of his authority within its walls. His military service consisted of 2 years as a supply clerk at a stateside base, a fact he rarely mentioned while regaling anyone who would listen with stories that grew more dramatic with each telling. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sight of Elena wearing what he considered authentic military gear while performing what he saw as menial labor offended his carefully constructed self-image as the facility's guardian of military legitimacy. In the days following their initial encounter, Marcus began arriving early to ensure he would be manning the security checkpoint when Elena reported for work. Each morning brought a new variation of the same ritual of humiliation, conducted with the theatrical precision of someone who had found his calling as a gatekeeper. He would examine her identification card with exaggerated skepticism, question whether she had authorization to enter certain areas of the building, and make loud comments about the importance of respecting military traditions for the benefit of anyone within earshot. The morning inspections became increasingly invasive and personal. Marcus demanded to see Elena's employee badge from multiple angles, claiming the photograph didn't match her current appearance. He questioned whether her jacket met the facility's dress code standards, despite the fact that no such standards existed for non-medical staff. Most cruelly, he began asking detailed questions about military protocol and terminology, setting traps designed to expose what he assumed was her fraudulent connection to military service. Elena's responses to these interrogations were measured and professional, which only seemed to fuel Marcus's conviction that she was hiding something. Her reluctance to engage in detailed discussions about her service record struck him as evidence of deception rather than privacy, and her calm demeanor under pressure registered as suspicious rather than admirable. The more composed she remained, the more determined he became to provoke a reaction that would justify his treatment of her. The harassment extended far beyond the security checkpoint as Marcus leveraged his relationships throughout the facility to build a network of allies in his campaign against Elena. Trevor Nash, a maintenance supervisor who had served briefly in the National Guard, became Marcus's most enthusiastic supporter, viewing the situation as an opportunity to demonstrate his own military credentials while aligning himself with someone he perceived as having institutional power. Trevor's contribution to Elena's daily misery took the form of equipment sabotage and workspace interference designed to make her job more difficult without leaving obvious evidence of deliberate sabotage. Elena would arrive at her desk to find her computer mysteriously slow to boot up, her filing cabinets locked despite her having the keys, or her office chair adjusted to uncomfortable heights that suggested someone had been tampering with her workspace after hours. When she submitted maintenance requests to address these issues, Trevor would respond with deliberate delays and explanations that suggested the problems were somehow her fault. The building's climate control became another weapon in Trevor's arsenal of petty torment. Elena's office would become unbearably hot during the summer months or freezing cold during the winter, with Trevor claiming that the antiquated HVAC system was impossible to regulate precisely. Other employees in adjacent offices experienced no such temperature fluctuations, but Elena's requests for climate adjustments were met with lectures about energy conservation and the impossibility of accommodating individual preferences in a large building. Director Patricia Holbrook maintained a carefully neutral stance toward the escalating workplace conflict, viewing it as a personnel management challenge rather than a serious threat to employee welfare. Her philosophy of conflict resolution involved encouraging all parties to work things out among themselves, while avoiding any actions that might create liability for the medical center. When Elena submitted a formal complaint about Marcus's behavior, Patricia responded with a generic email about the importance of professional communication and a suggestion that Elena might benefit from additional training in workplace interpersonal skills. The suggestion that Elena needed training in professional behavior struck her as particularly insulting given her military background in leadership and her exemplary performance record at the medical center. She had managed medical supply chains under enemy fire, coordinated casualty evacuations in hostile territory, and maintained discipline among combat-stressed soldiers during some of the most chaotic situations imaginable. The idea that she couldn't handle workplace communication seemed designed to transfer responsibility for the harassment from its perpetrators to its victim. Patricia's hands-off approach to management extended to her treatment of Marcus and Trevor, both of whom she viewed as long-term employees whose institutional knowledge made them valuable despite their personality flaws. She had fielded complaints about Marcus's aggressive behavior toward visitors and staff members before, but his union representation and the administration's reluctance to address security personnel issues had resulted in a pattern of verbal warnings that never translated into meaningful consequences. Elena's colleagues in the medical records department initially expressed sympathy for her situation, but gradually distanced themselves as the harassment campaign intensified and expanded to include anyone perceived as supporting her. Lisa Chang, who had worked in the department for 3 years, found herself subjected to Marcus's suspicious scrutiny whenever she arrived at work in Elena's company or was seen having lunch with her. Aaron Butler, who had initially offered to help Elena file a formal complaint, backed away from involvement after Trevor began citing imaginary building code violations in Aaron's workspace that required disruptive inspections and repairs. The isolation tactics proved effective in creating an atmosphere where supporting Elena carried social and professional risks that most employees were unwilling to accept. Conversations would stop when Elena entered the break room, and invitations to participate in group activities became increasingly rare. The message was clear: associating with Elena meant accepting secondary status in the facility's social hierarchy and potentially becoming a target for harassment yourself. The campaign against Elena extended beyond the walls of the medical center, as Marcus and Trevor began sharing their version of events with friends and family members who worked at other veterans' facilities throughout the Phoenix area. Their narrative portrayed Elena as a troubled individual who was exploiting military imagery for personal gain, while taking advantage of programs and services intended for legitimate veterans. These stories spread through informal networks of current and former military personnel, creating a reputation that preceded Elena wherever she went within the local veterans community. At Desert Springs Community College, where Elena taught her EMT courses, the harassment took on a different character but proved equally persistent. Someone had contacted the college administration with concerns about Elena's qualifications to teach medical procedures, questioning whether her background was sufficient to justify her instructor position. While the college's investigation quickly confirmed Elena's credentials and teaching effectiveness, the process required her to submit to additional scrutiny and documentation that felt like a professional violation. Her students began receiving anonymous messages questioning Elena's authenticity and suggesting that they demand proof of her medical qualifications before trusting her instruction. The messages encouraged students to record her classes and report any discrepancies between her teaching and official emergency medical protocols. While most students ignored these communications, the knowledge that her every word and action were potentially being scrutinized for evidence of incompetence created an additional layer of stress that affected Elena's natural teaching style. The psychological toll of constant vigilance and defensive positioning began affecting Elena's physical health and emotional well-being in ways that reminded her uncomfortably of her struggles with post-deployment adjustment 3 years earlier. Sleep became elusive as her mind replayed each day's confrontations and anticipated the next day's challenges. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive during combat deployments now felt like a liability in civilian life, where every unexpected sound or movement could trigger a stress response that left her exhausted. Elena's appetite diminished as chronic stress affected her digestive system, leading to weight loss that made her clothes hang loosely and gave her face a gaunt appearance that provided additional ammunition for those who questioned her fitness for her job responsibilities. The prescription medication she took for service-connected medical conditions required careful timing and dietary considerations that became more difficult to manage when her daily routine was constantly disrupted by harassment and confrontation. Most troubling was Elena's growing tendency to question her own perceptions and reactions to the hostile treatment she was receiving. The gaslighting techniques employed by Marcus and his allies were subtle but persistent, designed to make her doubt whether the harassment was really happening or whether she was overreacting to normal workplace interactions. Comments that seemed clearly hostile when they occurred could be later reframed as misunderstandings or attempts at humor, leaving Elena uncertain about her own judgment and reluctant to report incidents that might be dismissed as paranoia. The erosion of Elena's confidence in her own perceptions was particularly devastating given her military training in threat assessment and situational awareness. She had once been trusted to identify potential dangers in complex environments where mistakes could cost lives, but now she found herself second-guessing her ability to accurately interpret social dynamics in a medical office setting. The cognitive dissonance between her proven competence in high-stakes situations and her apparent inability to navigate workplace politics created a sense of professional inadequacy that threatened her core identity. Elena's isolation deepened as she withdrew from social activities and personal relationships that required emotional energy she no longer possessed. Phone calls from friends went unanswered, invitations to weekend activities were declined, and her apartment became a fortress where she could temporarily escape the constant pressure of defending her right to exist in spaces where she should have felt welcome. The olive drab jacket that had once represented pride and accomplishment now felt like a target painted on her back, marking her for treatment that seemed designed to drive her away from the community she had sacrificed so much to serve. The financial pressure of potentially losing her job at the medical center added another dimension to Elena's stress as she calculated how long her savings would last if the harassment campaign succeeded in forcing her resignation. The EMT instructor position at Desert Springs provided supplemental income but wouldn't be sufficient to cover her rent and medical expenses if she lost her primary employment. The prospect of starting over in a new career field, possibly in a different city, felt overwhelming when considered alongside the emotional toll of the ongoing persecution. Through all of this systematic assault on her dignity and professional standing, Elena maintained her commitment to excellence in job performance and teaching responsibilities. Her medical records work remained accurate and timely. Her EMT students continued to pass certification exams at rates above the college average, and her interactions with veterans and their families stayed professional and compassionate. The disconnect between her proven competence and the narrative being constructed about her character highlighted the arbitrary nature of the harassment while demonstrating the resilience that would ultimately determine the outcome of this extended campaign of intimidation. As autumn arrived in Phoenix and the intense summer heat began to subside, Elena Rodriguez prepared for what felt like the longest deployment of her life, fought not against a foreign enemy in a distant land, but against the corrosive effects of prejudice and assumption in the place she had hoped to call home. The battle lines had been drawn not across geographic boundaries, but through the corridors of institutions that should have provided sanctuary and support. Victory, if it came, would require a different kind of courage than anything her military training had prepared her for, demanding not the ability to fight, but the strength to endure until the moment when truth could finally speak louder than suspicion. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, delivered to Elena's desk in an official envelope bearing the seal of the Phoenix Veterans Affairs Regional Office. Inside, embossed letterhead announced the upcoming dedication ceremony for the new memorial wall at Riverside Veterans Medical Center, scheduled for Veterans Day weekend. The event would honor fallen service members from Arizona who had made the ultimate sacrifice in Iraq and Afghanistan, and all employees were encouraged to attend what promised to be a dignified commemoration of military service and sacrifice. Elena studied the invitation with mixed emotions, recognizing both an opportunity to honor fallen comrades and a potential minefield of public scrutiny in her current circumstances. The ceremony would draw hundreds of attendees, including active-duty military personnel, veteran service organization leaders, local politicians, and media representatives. Most significantly, the keynote speaker would be General William Hayes, a decorated five-star general whose military career had spanned 4 decades and included command positions in both Iraq and Afghanistan theaters where Elena had served. The prospect of attending an event where her military service might be publicly questioned felt daunting, but the alternative of staying away from a memorial service for fallen soldiers felt like a betrayal of values that had defined her entire adult life. Elena had lost friends and colleagues during her 3 deployments, young men and women whose names would likely appear on the memorial wall being dedicated. Her absence from their commemoration would represent a victory for those who had worked so hard to convince her that she didn't belong in the veterans community. Dr. Kevin Park stopped by Elena's desk that afternoon with his own copy of the invitation and an unexpected proposition. As supervisor of the medical records department, he had been asked to coordinate employee participation in the ceremony, including the selection of staff members who would serve as volunteer coordinators and guides for distinguished guests. The assignment carried some prestige within the medical center hierarchy and would involve direct interaction with high-ranking military officials and community leaders. Kevin had observed the harassment campaign against Elena with growing concern, recognizing both the injustice of her treatment and the potential legal liability it created for the medical center. His attempts to address the situation through official channels had been frustrated by Patricia Holbrook's hands-off management style and the institutional protection afforded to Marcus Webb through his union representation. The Veterans Day ceremony presented an opportunity to publicly recognize Elena's value to the organization while potentially exposing the inappropriate behavior she had endured. The offer to serve as a volunteer coordinator would place Elena in a visible role during the ceremony, requiring her to wear a special identification badge and interact with attendees who might ask questions about her background or qualifications. Kevin presented the opportunity honestly, acknowledging both the honor it represented and the risks it might entail given her current situation. The decision, he emphasized, was entirely hers to make without pressure or professional consequences regardless of her choice. Elena requested time to consider the offer, spending the remainder of the week weighing the potential benefits against the almost certain confrontation it would provoke. Marcus Webb and his allies had made it clear that they viewed any recognition of Elena's contributions as a personal affront to their campaign against her. Her appearance in an official capacity at such a high-profile event would be seen as a challenge to their narrative about her illegitimate presence in the veterans community. The decision crystallized during Elena's Thursday evening EMT class at Desert Springs Community College, when one of her students approached her after the session with a question that cut straight to the heart of her internal struggle. Maria Santos, a young woman pursuing EMT certification to support her goal of becoming a paramedic, had noticed Elena's subdued demeanor in recent weeks and wanted to know if everything was all right with her instructor whom she had come to respect and admire. Elena found herself sharing more about her situation than she had intended, describing the workplace harassment in general terms, without naming specific individuals or providing details that might compromise her position. Maria listened with the focused attention of someone who had faced her own challenges as a young Latina woman in a field traditionally dominated by men, nodding with understanding as Elena described the isolation and constant scrutiny she had endured. Maria's response was immediate and uncompromising in its clarity. She reminded Elena that the medical techniques and life-saving protocols they practiced in class weren't theoretical exercises but skills that would be used to help real people in genuine emergencies. The knowledge Elena shared in that classroom every week came from somewhere deep and authentic, earned through experience that couldn't be faked or borrowed from textbooks. If Elena believed in the value of what she taught, Maria argued, then she owed it to herself and her students to stand proud of however she had acquired that expertise. The conversation stayed with Elena through the weekend, as she walked through the quiet neighborhood surrounding her apartment complex, thinking about the soldiers whose names would soon be carved into the memorial wall, and the promises she had made to honor their sacrifice through continued service. The olive drab jacket hanging in her closet represented more than personal history. It connected her to a community of service that transcended the petty politics and personality conflicts that had made her recent months so difficult. On Monday morning, Elena knocked on Dr. Kevin Park's office door and accepted the position as volunteer coordinator for the Veterans Day ceremony. The decision felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff while trusting that years of training would somehow provide the skills needed to land safely. Kevin's relief was evident, as he outlined her responsibilities and provided the materials she would need to prepare for the event. The announcement of Elena's appointment as volunteer coordinator spread through the medical center with the same speed as previous gossip about her confrontations with Marcus Webb, but this time, the conversations carried undertones of curiosity rather than purely malicious entertainment. Some employees expressed surprise that someone so recently controversial would be given such a visible role, while others wondered if her selection indicated administrative support they hadn't previously recognized. Marcus Webb's reaction to the news was immediate and volcanic in its intensity. He cornered Elena at the security checkpoint the following morning with an fury that drew attention from everyone in the lobby, his voice rising as he demanded to know what authority had qualified her to represent the medical center at such an important event. The confrontation escalated until Frank Valdez, the senior security guard, was forced to intervene and remind Marcus that his job was to check identification badges, not interrogate employees about their work assignments. The incident marked a turning point in the harassment campaign as Marcus abandoned any pretense of professional behavior in favor of open hostility that was impossible for administrators to ignore. Trevor Nash joined the assault with complaints to Patricia Holbrook about Elena's qualifications for the coordinator position, arguing that someone without demonstrated military service shouldn't be trusted with responsibilities related to honoring fallen soldiers. Patricia found herself caught between competing pressures as the Veterans Day ceremony approached. The regional VA office had emphasized the importance of the event for community relations and media coverage, making any disruption or controversy potentially damaging to the medical center's reputation. At the same time, Marcus Webb's union representative had begun making noise about hostile work environment claims, and the potential for grievances if Marcus felt his concerns about Elena weren't being taken seriously. The solution Patricia chose reflected her management philosophy of avoiding decisive action in favor of bureaucratic procedures that might diffuse responsibility for whatever consequences emerged. She announced that all volunteer coordinators for the ceremony would be required to undergo additional background screening and provide documentation of their qualifications for interacting with distinguished guests and media representatives. The requirement applied to Elena alone among the selected coordinators, since the others were longtime employees whose backgrounds were already well established within the organization. Elena submitted to the additional screening without complaint, providing military discharge documentation, medical training certificates, and character references that painted a picture of exemplary service and professional competence. The process delayed her official confirmation for the coordinator role until just days before the ceremony, creating uncertainty that Marcus and Trevor interpreted as evidence that their campaign was succeeding. During the week leading up to Veterans Day, Elena threw herself into preparation for the ceremony with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her military service. She studied the biographical information of every distinguished guest, memorized the layout of the memorial wall and surrounding facilities, and coordinated with other volunteers to ensure seamless execution of an event that would honor fallen soldiers while showcasing the medical center's commitment to veteran care. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on Elena, as she prepared to guide military leaders and community officials through a facility where she had been systematically harassed and marginalized for months. The same colleagues who had avoided her in break rooms and declined to support her against workplace bullying would now watch her interact with some of the most senior military officers in the region, representing an institution that had barely tolerated her presence. Elena's preparation extended beyond logistical details to include careful consideration of what she would wear to the ceremony. The olive drab jacket that had become a lightning rod for criticism would be replaced by a more formal blazer that wouldn't provide ammunition for those looking to question her authenticity or appropriateness. Her goal was to honor the fallen soldiers being commemorated while avoiding any distraction from their sacrifice. The night before the ceremony, Elena sat in her apartment reviewing her notes and thinking about the soldiers whose names would be unveiled on the memorial wall the following day. Some of those names belonged to people she had known personally, young men and women who had served alongside her in the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan. Others represented stories she would never know but sacrifices she understood intimately through her own experience of loss and survival in combat zones. The weight of representing those stories while defending her own right to belong in the veterans community felt overwhelming as Elena considered the potential consequences of the following day's events. Success in her coordinator role might vindicate her position at the medical center and demonstrate her value to skeptical colleagues, but it would also intensify the scrutiny of those determined to prove her unworthy of recognition or respect. Failure, whether through her own mistakes or sabotage by others, would confirm the narrative that had been constructed about her incompetence and illegitimate claim to military identity. The stakes couldn't have been higher as Elena prepared for what felt like the most important mission of her civilian life, one that would determine not only her future at Riverside Veterans Medical Center, but her place in the broader community of veterans she had served alongside and continued to honor through her work. As dawn broke over Phoenix on Veterans Day morning, Elena Rodriguez stood at her bedroom window looking out at a city preparing to honor its military heroes, while she prepared for a battle that would test everything she had learned about courage, dignity, and the true meaning of service. The next few hours would reveal whether the values instilled during her military training could survive the assault of prejudice and assumption, or whether the campaign to drive her away from the veterans community would finally succeed in breaking her resolve to belong where she had earned the right to stand. The morning of November 11th arrived with the crisp clarity that defines autumn in the Arizona desert, where the oppressive heat of summer yields to days that feel like gifts from a more temperate climate. Elena Rodriguez arrived at Riverside Veterans Medical Center 90 minutes before the ceremony's scheduled start, carrying herself with the purposeful stride of someone who had learned long ago that preparation was the difference between success and catastrophe in high-stakes situations. The medical center's main courtyard had been transformed overnight into an amphitheater of remembrance, with rows of folding chairs arranged in precise formation facing a draped memorial wall that would soon reveal the names of 147 Arizona service members who had died in Iraq and Afghanistan. A small stage accommodated speakers and distinguished guests, while security barriers channeled the flow of arriving attendees through designated checkpoints where credentials would be verified and programs distributed. Elena wore a navy blazer over gray slacks, her coordinator badge prominently displayed and her hair pulled back in a style that projected professional competence without drawing unnecessary attention. The olive drab jacket remained in her apartment closet, a calculated decision to minimize potential distractions from the ceremony's solemn purpose. Her clipboard contained detailed schedules, contact information for key participants, and contingency plans for weather or security concerns that might disrupt the proceedings. The first distinguished guests began arriving at 8:30, their black sedans and military vehicles creating a motorcade that stretched along the medical center's main entrance. Elena positioned herself near the VIP reception area, greeting each arrival with practiced courtesy while coordinating their movement to designated staging areas. The interactions required her to project confidence and authority while managing logistics that would have challenged experienced event planners with significantly more resources. General William Hayes arrived precisely at 9:15, emerging from an armored SUV with the bearing of someone accustomed to command in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. At 63, he carried himself with the straight-backed posture of a career military officer, his dress uniform adorned with ribbons and decorations that told the story of 4 decades spent serving in every major conflict of his generation. His presence commanded immediate attention from everyone in the reception area, creating a bubble of respectful silence as he surveyed the ceremony preparations. Elena approached the general with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the morning, introducing herself as the volunteer coordinator assigned to assist with his participation in the program. Hayes acknowledged her greeting with a brief nod, his attention focused on the logistics of the event and the schedule of activities leading up to his keynote address. Their initial interaction lasted less than 2 minutes, but Elena noticed the general's quick assessment of her demeanor and competence, the practiced evaluation of a leader sizing up subordinates. The arrival of local media representatives added another layer of complexity to Elena's responsibilities, as television crews positioned cameras and print journalists sought interviews with ceremony participants. David Kim from the Arizona Republic had been assigned to cover the event for the newspaper's Veterans Day edition, and his questions about the memorial wall's significance and the medical center's role in veteran care required Elena to provide background information while managing the competing demands of other guests and participants. Marcus Webb's presence at the ceremony represented a wild card that Elena had factored into her planning without being able to predict exactly how it might affect the proceedings. As head of security for the event, Marcus wore a supervisory badge that gave him authority to interact with distinguished guests and media representatives, creating opportunities for him to undermine Elena's work or create disruptions that might embarrass the medical center. His movements throughout the morning carried an undercurrent of barely contained hostility, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The first sign of trouble emerged during Elena's briefing of volunteer ushers, when Marcus interrupted to question whether she had properly coordinated security clearances for media personnel who would be moving throughout the restricted areas. His challenge came in front of a group that included Dr. Kevin Park and several department supervisors, creating a public test of Elena's authority and competence at a moment when any uncertainty could undermine her credibility with senior staff. Elena responded to Marcus's challenge with calm precision, producing documentation that showed all media credentials had been verified according to established protocols, and that she had coordinated directly with federal security personnel to ensure compliance with regulations governing events involving high-ranking military officials. Her response not only answered Marcus's question but demonstrated a level of preparation that exceeded what most people would have expected from a medical records clerk serving as volunteer coordinator. The exchange drew attention from General Hayes, who had been reviewing his speaking notes nearby and overheard the discussion about security protocols. The general's military background had taught him to recognize competence in logistical planning, and Elena's handling of the security question suggested training and experience that went beyond typical civilian event management. His curiosity was piqued by the disconnect between her current role and the expertise she had just demonstrated. As the ceremony's start time approached, Elena coordinated the final arrangements with military precision that drew increasingly curious glances from attendees who had witnessed her interactions with various challenges throughout the morning. She communicated with security personnel using terminology that suggested familiarity with military operations, managed competing priorities with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations, and maintained professional composure despite the obvious tension between herself and Marcus Webb. The opening of the ceremony proceeded flawlessly as Elena guided distinguished guests to their designated seats and ensured that media representatives had optimal positioning for recording the proceedings. The invocation was delivered by a military chaplain who had served multiple deployments in Iraq, his words carrying the weight of personal experience with loss and sacrifice that would be commemorated by the memorial wall's dedication. Director Patricia Holbrook delivered welcoming remarks that praised the medical center's commitment to veteran care while acknowledging the sacrifice of families and communities affected by military service. Her speech had been carefully crafted to avoid controversial topics and focus on themes of unity and gratitude that would resonate with the diverse audience assembled for the ceremony. Elena stood at the edge of the stage area, monitoring the proceedings while remaining ready to address any logistical issues that might arise. The keynote address by General Hayes was scheduled as the ceremony's centerpiece, following musical performances by a high school marching band and remarks by local veterans organization leaders. Elena's responsibility during this segment involved coordinating the general's movement to the podium while ensuring that audio equipment functioned properly and that any last-minute changes to the program were communicated to relevant personnel. As General Hayes approached the podium, Elena noticed Marcus Webb positioning himself near the media area where his security badge would allow him to interact with journalists and potentially influence their coverage of the event. The placement struck her as unusual, given his normal responsibilities, but she focused on her immediate duties rather than trying to anticipate what disruption he might be planning. The general's speech began with traditional themes of sacrifice and service, honoring the fallen soldiers whose names would soon be revealed on the memorial wall. His delivery carried the authority of someone who had personally known many of the casualties being commemorated, and his words resonated with an audience that included family members, fellow veterans, and community leaders who had been touched by the losses represented in the memorial. Midway through his address, General Hayes shifted his focus to the importance of recognizing military service in all its forms, acknowledging that the veteran community included people serving in civilian roles who continued to embody military values of dedication, competence, and selfless service. His comments seemed directed toward the broader theme of veteran reintegration, but Elena noticed his gaze occasionally moving in her direction as he spoke about the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian careers. The ceremony's most dramatic moment came during the unveiling of the memorial wall, when black draping fell away to reveal 107 names etched in granite, arranged chronologically by date of death and accompanied by unit designations and theaters of operation. The sight prompted audible gasps and tears from family members in attendance, while veterans and active duty personnel stood at attention in recognition of their fallen comrades. Elena found herself scanning the names with the focused attention of someone searching for familiar entries, her military training having taught her to process information quickly while maintaining situational awareness of her surroundings. The list included soldiers from units she had served alongside during her Afghanistan deployments, young men and women whose faces she could still picture despite the years that had passed since their deaths. The emotional impact of seeing those names carved in permanent stone was more powerful than Elena had anticipated, bringing back memories of memorial services conducted in forward operating bases where temporary crosses marked graves that would later be transferred to Arlington National Cemetery or hometown burial grounds. The weight of those losses had been something she carried privately since her return to civilian life, rarely acknowledging even to herself how deeply the experience of combat had marked her. As the formal ceremony concluded and attendees began moving toward a reception area where refreshments would be served, Elena coordinated the departure of distinguished guests while managing the logistics of crowd control and media interviews. Her performance throughout the event had been flawless from an operational standpoint, but she remained focused on completing her responsibilities rather than celebrating what appeared to be a successful conclusion to months of preparation. General Hayes lingered near the memorial wall after other VIP guests had departed, studying the names and unit designations with the careful attention of someone conducting a personal inventory of losses from his decades of military service. Elena approached to offer assistance with his departure schedule, but the general seemed in no hurry to leave, instead engaging her in conversation about the medical center's veteran care programs and her role in coordinating the day's events. The conversation took an unexpected turn when General Hayes mentioned noticing Elena's competence in handling security protocols and logistical coordination, skills that suggested training beyond what most civilian employees would possess. His question about her background was phrased casually, but Elena recognized the practiced technique of a senior officer gathering information about subordinates who had demonstrated unusual capabilities. Elena's response was carefully measured, acknowledging her military service without providing details that might prompt additional questions or scrutiny. She mentioned serving as a medic in Afghanistan while keeping the focus on her current role at the medical center and her commitment to supporting veteran care programs. The general nodded with understanding, recognizing the diplomatic approach of someone who valued privacy while remaining truthful about their experience. The conversation might have ended there, a brief exchange between a senior military officer and a civilian employee who had demonstrated professional competence during an important ceremony. Instead, Marcus Webb chose that moment to make his move, approaching the general with information he claimed was relevant to the security of future events at the medical center. Marcus's approach was calculated to appear helpful and professional, but his words carried unmistakable implications about Elena's qualifications for the coordinator role and her appropriateness for representing the medical center at veteran-related events. He suggested that the general might want to be aware of questions that had been raised about certain employees who wore military clothing without having earned the right to represent themselves as legitimate veterans. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, drawing immediate attention from nearby attendees and creating a moment of crisis that would determine not only Elena's future at the medical center, but her place in the broader veteran community. General Hayes turned his full attention to the unfolding situation, his expression shifting from casual interest to focused assessment as he evaluated the dynamics between Elena and Marcus Webb. Elena stood perfectly still as Marcus continued his character assassination, feeling the familiar calm that had sustained her through combat situations where panic meant death and clear thinking was the only path to survival. She recognized this moment as the culmination of everything that had been building since her first encounter with Marcus at the security checkpoint, the final test of whether she would be allowed to remain in the community she had served and sacrificed to defend. The general's response would determine everything that followed, and Elena prepared herself for whatever judgment was about to be rendered by someone whose authority in military matters was unquestionable. The memorial wall stood behind them, its 147 names serving as silent witnesses to a confrontation that would reveal whether the values those soldiers had died defending still mattered in the place where their sacrifice was being honored. General William Hayes studied Marcus Webb with the cold assessment of a commander evaluating intelligence reports from an unreliable source. 4 decades of military service had taught him to recognize the difference between legitimate security concerns and personal vendettas disguised as professional duty. Marcus's aggressive posture and barely concealed satisfaction suggested motivations that had nothing to do with protecting the integrity of veteran commemoration ceremonies. The general's attention shifted to Elena Rodriguez, whose reaction to the accusation revealed more about her character than any verbal defense could have accomplished. She stood with the relaxed alertness of someone accustomed to hostile environments, her breathing steady and her expression calm despite the public nature of the attack on her credibility. Hayes recognized the bearing immediately, having observed it countless times in combat veterans who had learned to maintain composure under fire. The small crowd that had gathered around the memorial wall included several media representatives, medical center staff members, and family members of fallen soldiers who had attended the dedication ceremony. David Kim from the Arizona Republic had his recorder ready, sensing that the confrontation might produce a story more compelling than routine coverage of a memorial service. The presence of witnesses raised the stakes for everyone involved, transforming a workplace dispute into a public test of institutional values and personal integrity. Hayes stepped closer to Elena, his movement deliberate and commanding enough to shift the attention of everyone present from Marcus's accusations to whatever the general might say in response. The silence stretched for several seconds as Hayes appeared to consider the situation from multiple angles, weighing evidence and implications with the methodical approach of someone whose decisions had once carried life or death consequences for thousands of personnel under his command. When the general finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute certainty combined with barely controlled anger at what he had just witnessed. "Mr. Webb," he said, his tone formal and unmistakably dismissive, "I've spent 43 years in military service, including 7 combat deployments and command responsibilities in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I've learned to recognize competence, professionalism and authentic military bearing when I see it." The general paused, allowing his words to register with the assembled crowd before continuing with devastating precision. "What I've observed here today from Ms. Rodriguez represents the highest standards of logistical coordination, security awareness, and operational excellence that I would expect from the most experienced military personnel. Her handling of complex protocols, management of competing priorities, and maintenance of composure under pressure demonstrate training and experience that cannot be faked or acquired through casual observation." Elena felt her heart rate increase as she realized where the general's assessment was leading, but she maintained her professional stance while processing the implications of having her background evaluated so publicly by someone whose judgment carried unquestionable authority in military circles. The moment felt suspended in time, like the seconds between calling for medical evacuation and hearing the helicopter rotors that meant survival for wounded soldiers under her care. General Hayes turned his full attention to Elena, his expression softening slightly as he addressed her directly for the first time since Marcus's interruption. "Ms. Rodriguez, your coordination of today's ceremony has been exemplary, but more importantly, your conduct throughout this exchange has demonstrated exactly the kind of dignity and professionalism that honors the service members we're here to commemorate. Would you mind sharing with these folks the unit you served with in Afghanistan?" The question carried the tone of a superior officer requesting information from a subordinate, but Elena recognized the underlying offer of vindication and support from someone whose endorsement would silence her critics permanently. She glanced briefly at the memorial wall behind them, thinking of the names etched in granite, and the soldiers she had served alongside who would never have the opportunity to defend their own honor in civilian life. Elena's voice carried clearly across the gathering as she provided the information that would transform her status from questioned outsider to recognized veteran. "I served 3 deployments with the 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment as a combat medic, sir. 2 tours in Kunar Province and 1 in Helmand, attached to forward operating bases conducting medical support for reconnaissance and direct action missions." The impact of Elena's revelation was immediate and electric, spreading through the crowd like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The 75th Ranger Regiment represented one of the Army's most elite units, whose members underwent selection processes that eliminated the vast majority of candidates, and whose combat operations took place in the most dangerous areas of Afghanistan. Elena's service with the Rangers explained not only her competence in logistical coordination, but her calm response to confrontation, and her instinctive understanding of military protocol. General Hayes nodded with satisfaction, his expression conveying both respect for Elena's service record and disapproval of the treatment she had endured from people who should have recognized her contributions to the veteran community. His next words were directed toward Marcus Webb, but spoken loudly enough for everyone present to hear clearly. "Mr. Webb, I suggest you educate yourself about the service records of the people you work alongside before making accusations that demonstrate your own ignorance about military service and sacrifice." The general's rebuke was delivered with the controlled intensity of a commander addressing subordinates who had failed to meet expected standards of conduct. Marcus's face flushed red as he realized that his attempt to discredit Elena had instead exposed his own lack of knowledge about military operations and his inappropriate behavior toward a veteran whose service record far exceeded his own. The presence of media representatives meant that his humiliation would be documented and potentially broadcast to a wider audience. Dr. Kevin Park stepped forward from the crowd, his relief at Elena's vindication evident in his expression as he addressed General Hayes directly. "General, Ms. Rodriguez has been an exemplary employee whose contributions to our veteran care programs have been invaluable. I want to apologize on behalf of the medical center for any inappropriate treatment she may have received from our staff." The apology represented more than personal support for Elena. It signaled institutional recognition that the harassment campaign against her had been both unjustified and potentially damaging to the medical center's reputation among the veteran community. Patricia Holbrook, who had remained silent during the confrontation, now faced the uncomfortable reality that her hands-off management approach had allowed a decorated combat veteran to be systematically mistreated by employees whose own service records paled in comparison to Elena's sacrifice. David Kim approached Elena with his recorder, recognizing that her story represented exactly the kind of human interest piece that would resonate with readers far beyond the local veteran community.
The transformation from questioned employee to recognized hero provided a narrative arc that highlighted broader issues about veteran recognition and the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian careers. Elena agreed to a brief interview, understanding that sharing her experience might help other veterans facing similar challenges. The media attention that followed Elena's public recognition by General Hayes created ripple effects throughout the Phoenix veteran community and beyond. The Arizona Republic's feature story about the combat medic who had been working quietly at a veteran medical center while enduring harassment from colleagues who questioned her authenticity struck a chord with readers across the country. Social media amplified the story, generating hundreds of comments from veterans who shared similar experiences of having their service questioned or minimized by people who had never worn a uniform. Marcus Webb's role in the harassment campaign became a focal point of criticism from veteran advocacy organizations, who used his behavior as an example of how prejudice and assumption could harm the very people that veteran service organizations were supposed to support. His union representation proved ineffective against the weight of public opinion and the medical center's need to distance itself from his actions. Within 2 weeks of the Veterans Day ceremony, Marcus had submitted his resignation rather than face formal disciplinary proceedings that would have likely resulted in his termination. Trevor Nash found himself similarly isolated as his participation in the harassment campaign became widely known throughout the medical center. His attempts to minimize his role and claim that he had simply been following Marcus's lead were undermined by testimony from other employees who had witnessed his deliberate sabotage of Elena's workspace and equipment. The maintenance department's supervisory position became available when Trevor accepted a transfer to a different facility rather than continue working in an environment where his behavior had made him a pariah. The transformation in Elena's workplace experience was dramatic and immediate. Colleagues who had previously avoided interaction with her now sought opportunities to learn about her military experience and express belated support for her contributions to veteran care programs. The medical records department became a destination for employees wanting to hear first-hand accounts of military service, and Elena found herself reluctantly cast in the role of military expert and veteran advocate. General Hayes maintained contact with Elena following the Veterans Day ceremony, recommending her for recognition by veteran service organizations and suggesting opportunities for her to share her expertise with military transition programs. His endorsement opened doors that had been closed to Elena since her return to civilian life, including consulting opportunities with organizations working to improve veteran healthcare and employment support services. The most significant change in Elena's circumstances came through an unexpected phone call from the Department of Veterans Affairs Regional Office, where administrators had learned about her background through media coverage of the Veterans Day ceremony. The VA offered Elena a position as a Veteran Services Coordinator, a role that would allow her to use her military experience and medical training to help other veterans navigate the complex process of accessing healthcare and disability benefits. The new position represented more than career advancement. It offered Elena the opportunity to return to meaningful service within the veteran community while utilizing skills that had been undervalued in her previous role. The work would be challenging and emotionally demanding, requiring her to help veterans who were struggling with issues ranging from homelessness to post-traumatic stress, but it aligned perfectly with her personal mission of continued service to those who had sacrificed for their country. Elena's acceptance of the VA position created an opening in the medical records department that Dr. Kevin Park filled by promoting Lisa Chang, whose loyalty to Elena during the harassment campaign had demonstrated both professional integrity and personal courage. The promotion sent a clear message throughout the medical center that supporting colleagues against unfair treatment was valued and rewarded, while participating in harassment campaigns would result in professional consequences. The Desert Springs Community College EMT program benefited from Elena's increased visibility within the veteran community as enrollment grew among military veterans seeking healthcare careers. Elena's teaching took on new dimensions as students realized they were learning from someone whose medical experience had been earned in combat situations where mistakes could cost lives. The authenticity of her instruction, combined with her patient approach to helping students master complex procedures, made her one of the most respected instructors in the college's healthcare programs. 6 months after the Veterans Day ceremony, Elena returned to Riverside Veterans Medical Center for the dedication of a new Veteran Services office that would provide transition assistance and career counseling for recently discharged military personnel. The facility had been designed with input from Elena and other veteran advocates who understood the challenges of adapting military skills to civilian employment opportunities. General Hayes delivered the dedication address, using the occasion to highlight Elena's story as an example of how the veteran community could better support its members through recognition, respect, and opportunities for continued service. His remarks emphasized that military service created lasting bonds and responsibilities that extended far beyond active duty, requiring ongoing commitment to supporting fellow veterans through successful reintegration into civilian society. Elena's role in the dedication ceremony was ceremonial rather than logistical, allowing her to participate as an honored guest rather than a behind-the-scenes coordinator. She wore her dress uniform for the first time since her military discharge, the ribbons and decorations telling the story of her service to anyone familiar with military recognition systems. The Purple Heart on her chest drew respectful nods from other veterans in attendance, a visible reminder of the sacrifice that had earned her the right to wear the uniform she had once hidden in her apartment closet. The ceremony concluded with Elena cutting the ribbon for the new Veteran Services Office, a symbolic gesture that represented not only the opening of a new facility but the recognition of veteran contributions to their communities long after their military service had ended. The applause from the assembled crowd included many of the same people who had witnessed her public vindication 6 months earlier, their appreciation now based on full knowledge of her background and contributions rather than assumptions about her worthiness to belong. As the crowd dispersed and Elena prepared to return to her new office at the VA regional headquarters, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from isolation and harassment to recognition and meaningful work within the veteran community. The olive drab jacket that had once made her a target now hung in her office closet alongside her dress uniform, both representing different aspects of her identity as someone who had served her country in uniform and continued to serve fellow veterans in civilian life. The memorial wall at Riverside Veterans Medical Center continued to honor the 147 Arizona service members who had made the ultimate sacrifice in Iraq and Afghanistan, their names serving as a permanent reminder of the cost of military service and the obligations of those who survived to honor their memory through continued dedication to the values they had died defending. Elena's story had become part of the wall's legacy, demonstrating that recognition and respect were battles that sometimes had to be fought long after the shooting stopped, requiring different weapons but the same courage that had sustained her through 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan. The lesson of Elena Rodriguez's experience resonated far beyond the Phoenix veteran community, inspiring other veterans to share their own stories of challenge and triumph, while encouraging civilian communities to look more carefully at the quiet heroes living and working among them. Her journey from marginalized employee to recognized leader proved that authentic service spoke louder than assumptions, and that the strongest victories were often won not through confrontation, but through the patient demonstration of character, competence, and unwavering commitment to the values that define true military service. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.